The Sony A6700 and A7C II are both positioned as hybrid cameras, which means they're good for both photos and videos. They have a few similarities, which is why you might be trying to decide which of these two is best for you, but also a couple of differences that should be taken into consideration. After doing in-depth reviews and heavy testing with both of these cameras, I'll be putting the main highlights head-to-head to ultimately help you decide which of the two should land a place in your bag. Let's get to the studio and give it all a proper look. Welcome to the studio, and you ever open one of these nitro coffees? Just the pretty cool. The first thing we'll look at between these two cameras is going to be the low light and overall ISO performance. Starting out with the ISO ranges for these two cameras, the A7C II is going to have an ISO range of 100 up to 51,200, and that is going to be expandable both for photo and video to 50 up to 102,400. And the A6700 is going to have an ISO range of 100 up to 32,000, and it's going to have that same expandable range of 50 up to 102,400, but only for photos, not for video on that expandable range. Let's take a look at how they perform at those higher ISOs, which is what matters the most for low light. Good news is that they both have a dual baseline ISO feature, which is what's going to be very helpful when you're in those higher ISOs to maintain a good-looking low-noise image. Taking a look at the A7C II here, at its baseline ISO, the image is really clean, the shadows and dark areas are nice and smooth. This little section here is going to be zoomed in at 500%, which is an extreme amount, so keep that in mind as we run through all of this. And with that A7C II, let's bring it up to a 20,000 ISO, which is what I'd consider a high ISO for this camera. There's a noticeable amount more noise, but the colors and overall dynamic range is actually really impressive. And let's do that exact same thing with the A6700 before we look at them side by side. The baseline ISO in this A6700 is nice and clean in those darker areas, which is exactly what we'd expect. Let's bring the ISO on the A6700 up to 12,800, which I consider to be a comparable high ISO to the A7C II. And similar story here, where the noise is there, but if you look at that non-zoomed in image, I'm pretty happy with how that looks. And then let's take a look at them side by side at those comparable high ISO values to see the noise difference, as well as how the colors and tones look at those higher ISOs, because those colors and tones kind of tend to fall apart a bit when the ISO levels are cranked up. Practically speaking, and what I think, although this is very subjective, what I think is a usable ISO, like the highest usable ISO you could go with either camera. On the A7C II, I don't think anything over 20,000 ISO is usable, and on the A6700, I think our max usable ISO limit is 12,800. The A7C II is a clear winner here, but it's also a full-frame camera. I'd expect that. But that's not to say that the A6700 isn't a strong low-light performer, especially for an APS-C crop sensor camera. Moving into overall video quality, these cameras have a lot of similarities and a few key differences. Both of their 4K video output is being oversampled from something larger than 4K, which makes that 4K image nice and sharp, and I really like the quality, and you can see the differences between the two cameras on a similar shot right here. In terms of codecs, they're the exact same. They both have XAVC-SI, which is arguably the highest quality codec, also massive file sizes. They have XAVC-S, which is Sony's traditional and standard codec that they've used forever. And that XAVC-S is technically a lower quality than the XAVC-SI, but you're looking at XAVC-S right now, and I've used it for all of my YouTube videos. We also have XAVC-HS, which is a fantastic codec in that it's smaller file sizes, kind of like XAVC-S, but still maintains really high quality, kind of like XAVC-SI. The only real downside to XAVC-HS is that it's an H.265 file type, which means that your computer needs to be able to handle that. But then we get to frame rates, where these cameras start to separate themselves a little bit. They do both have 4K 24 frames per second, 30 and 60, but where the A6700 does win is that it does have 4K and 120 frames per second. But then we got to talk about the crop factor. factor. The A6700 has a tiny 1.04 times crop in 4K 60, which is next to nothing. But then the A7C Mark II, when it's in 4K 60, unfortunately has a 1.5 times video crop. And then when it comes to 4K 120, we already learned that the A7C Mark II doesn't shoot in 4K 120. And when the A6700 is in 4K 120, it has a 1.58 times crop, which is a pretty significant crop, but it is still pretty cool that the camera can shoot in 4K 120 if you can get past that crop factor. Here's what a 1.5 times crop looks like coming out of the A7C Mark II when it gets put into 4K 60. And then over here on the A6700, this is what that marginal 1.04 times crop looks like when it's in 4K 60. But here is what that 1.58 times crop looks like when the A6700 is in 4K 120. From an overall color settings and color science perspective, these cameras are outstanding, and they both share 422 10-bit color, which is a huge upgrade from previous Sony cameras. I love 10-bit, and you're looking at what these two cameras look like once again with their overall color science side by side with the exact same settings on both cameras in the same lighting conditions. I have a hard time telling the two apart when it comes to color, and I think Sony over the past few years has absolutely crushed it when it comes to their color science, and the video is looking outstanding. They both also share the picture profiles of S-Log3, which we can utilize that 10-bit color really well with S-Log3. And they also have the highly desirable S-Cinetone picture profile, which is going to be an image that looks really good straight out of camera. You don't have to worry about much editing or color grading in post. It's kind of tough to pick a winner when it comes to the video quality category, because the A6700 can do things from a 4K slow motion perspective that the A7C Mark II can't. But then the A7C Mark II, I think, does have just a better looking image overall. It's a bit subjective there. So I'd have to give them a tie. And I think the main differences with video quality just come down to the fact that one's full frame and one's a crop sensor camera. And we'll get into those sensor differences shortly. Speaking of overall video quality and wanting your videos to look great, make sure you stick around to the end because I've got something special for you. From a live streaming perspective, the cameras are almost identical. First thing is to connect them to your computer. Couldn't be easier. You just connect a USB-C cable, and that's it. There's no softwares or additional things you need to do for your computer to recognize the camera. And they both have an output of 4K and 30 frames per second, which is a fantastic feature when it comes to live streaming. I have to give the win here, though, to the A7C Mark II, because there is an overheating thing that we're going to talk about right now. This overheating topic might be one that sways you in one direction versus the other. When it comes to the A7C Mark II, I don't have any concerns about that camera overheating through all of my testing. The only real time I had it overheat after a long format recording in all different frame rates, again, no concerns about the A7C Mark II when it comes to overheating in almost any situation in the studio. Direct sunlight could affect all of this, so keep that in mind. But I don't have concerns about the A7C Mark II with overheating. The only time I got it to overheat was when I was using it as a live streaming webcam while recording to the SD card at the exact same time, which is pretty demanding on any camera. I did get it to overheat at just over an hour. And then on the A6700, when it comes to overheating, good news here is that I did not get it to overheat in regular recording. 4K 24, 4K 30, long format recording, never got it to overheat. In 4K 60, I got over 2 hours with no overheating and just shut the test down because I got bored. But when it comes to live streaming with the A6700 in that 4K 30 resolution, which is the one you're likely going to want to use if you're getting a camera like this, it's overheating in just over 30 to 40 minutes on a regular basis. So kind of a downside there when it comes to overheating. That's why I gave that point to the A7C Mark II for live streaming, because 30, 40 minutes isn't a ton of time that the A6700 gives us. And when it comes to overheating in general, because they're so comparable, but the A7C Mark II definitely wins out when it comes to live streaming recording with no overheating issues, besides that one where if you're recording to an SD card at the same time as overheating, it's about an hour. Besides that, the A7C Mark II absolutely wins the overheating test. If you're getting something from this video, let me know by giving it a tap on the thumbs up to let me know to keep making videos just like this one. And while you're down there, let me know in the comments which camera you're leaning toward or which one you already have. And if you don't know yet, maybe one of these points coming up in a second is going to help you make that decision. When it comes to in-body image stabilization, both of these cameras have what's called active stabilization from Sony. They have standard as well, which is fine. The active one's your best option. It does come with a 1.1 times crop in that active mode, which here's what that crop is going to look like. When it comes to ratings of stabilization, the A6700 has 5 stops of stabilization, and the A7C Mark II has a really impressive 7 stops. But here's what that looks like from a practical perspective. With both cameras here side by side in active steady shot with a very similar focal length, with me just walking normally without trying to smooth anything out. The A7C Mark II does win here, but I don't think that there's a lot there. Because from a practical perspective, we're talking about handheld shots here, which that's really going to matter for obviously a handheld video shot, but also like a photography shot that has like a slower shutter where you want the image to still be nice and sharp. But those are pretty rare instances. I mean, from a video perspective, even though they have in-body image stabilization, it's not like I'm hand holding and it looks as good as it would look on a gimbal, which is kind of my point, that if you need really smooth footage from a handheld perspective, like crystal clear, smooth footage, you probably are using a gimbal. And from a practical use case, like a vlog style shot, both of these cameras' in-body image stabilization is completely sufficient to get a shot like that to look passable and smooth. I would even say from a handheld perspective, arguably the A6700 wins because it has that 4K 120, which is naturally going to be a lot smoother if you happen to be hand holding for some slow motion B-roll or something like that. So back on that point about if you need it to be smooth, like really smooth handheld, you probably have a gimbal, which makes these in-body image stabilization tests kind of useless. But if you technically want the best stabilization between these two cameras, the A7C Mark II is a clear winner. But from a practical use perspective, I don't think you'll notice a difference. These cameras have all of the new features that Sony's been putting into their cameras recently, which is pretty cool. Both of them have the ability to install user LUTs into the camera to see what your footage is going to look like with your LUT installed before you even hit record. They also have the new auto cropping feature, which is going to give the effect in camera like somebody is filming you, which can be nice for all the solo creators out there. And their autofocus systems are insane. It doesn't even make sense to compare the cameras from an autofocus perspective. They're both exceptional. They both have Sony's new AI chip for better subject recognition. Autofocus is a huge strength of these cameras. I have no concerns about the autofocus missing at all. And they both have the lens breathing compensation setting, which is going to crop in 1.1 times, which is next to nothing. And that's only going to work with Sony lenses, but what it's going to do is if you happen to have a lens that has a lot of breathing, which means it's going to create some pulsing on the edges of the frame and like the focal length will change slightly. That's not going to be a thing when you have the setting turned on. And because I get like 15 comments in all my YouTube videos about my jaw, we're going to give both of these cameras a close-up jaw shot for tying in the overall features and new Sony settings category. Moving into some photo capabilities between these two cameras, let's talk about frames per second or burst rate first. The A6700 has a burst rate of 11 frames per second that does drop down to 7 when you're in lossless compressed RAW, which you'll likely be in if you're shooting photos with this camera. And the A7C Mark II has 10 frames per second, which drops down to 6 frames per second in that same lossless compressed RAW. And both cameras have lossless compressed RAW, which Sony claims has no deterioration over your images over something like uncompressed RAW, which is technically the highest quality RAW setting. And that lossless compressed RAW is really nice for those higher frames per second, higher duration of trying to get a lot of burst shots. Because if you're holding down the trigger for a long period of time in RAW, the buffer is going to fill up and the frames per second is going to drop pretty significantly. In uncompressed RAW, that happens pretty quick. In the lossless compressed RAW, again, we don't lose any quality there, as Sony claims, and we also get a significant amount more shots before that buffer fills up. In terms of megapixels, the A7C Mark II is a 33 megapixel sensor, and the A6700 is coming in at 24 megapixels. And 33 megapixels is obviously more than 24 megapixels, and where that really comes into play is with heavily cropping into the image without losing a ton of detail. And with that, you have to give that one to the A7C Mark II, but I've also also taken some of my favorite photos that I've ever taken with the A6700. I love how sharp they are. They have plenty of space to still crop in, and I think 24 megapixels is plenty. When it comes to overall photo capabilities though, it's also here kind of tough to pick a winner. The A6700 has a higher frames per second by 1 frame, which is negligible, and the A7C Mark II has more megapixels of 33 versus the 24 in the A6700, which seems like a lot, but I also think that difference is kind of negligible. I'm gonna have to give it a tie. I think a lot of the differences in the photo quality is gonna come back to the differences of the sensors between these two cameras, which we're about to get into when we talk about the camera body. When it comes to the camera body, I think the A6700 generally just feels better. The grip is a lot more substantial, feels better in the hand, but they're both weather sealed. The buttons and dials feel premium and the materials are really nice. They both take the Sony Z battery, which is a fantastic battery with plenty of battery life for whatever you want to do. And they have the digital hot shoe, which can be really nice for using one of Sony's newer microphones for wireless 4-channel recording. They both only have one SD card slot. And although the technology's come a really long way with SD cards, and as long as you get quality SD cards, you shouldn't have any issues with any of those failing. But if you're a pro shooting once in a lifetime or covering once in a lifetime stuff, you probably need 2 SD card slots for redundancy and insurance, but you already know that. Another downside to that compact design between these two cameras is that they only have a micro HDMI port. They're okay. They're not going to break every time you use them, but the odds of micro HDMIs breaking, unfortunately, is kind of high. In terms of buttons and dials, the camera layouts here are so similar. The only real difference that I see is that the A6700 has one more customizable button than the A7C Mark II, but the A7C Mark II has one more dial than the A6700. When it comes to the screen, both cameras here, I think they're the exact same screen. I'm not certain, but they are both 1.037 million dots, which is not class leading in terms of brightness and clarity, but I think it's really good and it absolutely gets the job done. Both screens are also fully articulating, and nice to see here, you can also change settings like ISO, white balance, shutter speed, aperture. You can change settings from the touchscreen, which is something that's been recently introduced in Sony cameras in this category. They both have the side positioned electronic viewfinder. It's not my favorite simply from where it's located, and the overall quality of it isn't something anybody's writing home about. And now when it comes to the sensor, and one of the most obvious differences between these two cameras, the A7C Mark II is a full frame sensor and the A6700 is a crop sensor. And the main things you're going to notice there is that full frame is going to do better in low light. Full frame is going to have better compression or better separation of the subject to the background, so that blurry effect. And there's also just what people talk about to be this full frame look to your photos and videos. Here's my thoughts on those 3 points. From a low noise, high ISO, low light performance perspective, full frame is noticeably better. But the A6700 is still a really good performer in low light, especially for a crop sensor camera. But if you're in a studio like I am right now, and the majority of your shots are going to be like this, that low light thing is not a factor at all. But if you are going to be in a situation regularly enough where you want the best performance with low light and you're trying to decide between these two cameras, the A7C Mark II is going to be a clear winner. And then when it comes to this blurry background, better subject separation from the background on full frame versus crop sensor, I have a really hard time seeing that. Maybe it's just me, but I don't notice that difference. If you went like apples to apples, like lens to lens, focal length to focal length, same aperture, and like pixel peeped it, like maybe you could see something. But what I'm seeing is that it's not that big of a difference. It's not that noticeable. And also full frame lenses are going to be a lot more expensive. And I think a lot of that background blur, that separation, a lot of it comes down to the lens. So getting a 1.4 lens for a full frame, you're paying a premium, and getting a 1.4 lens for a crop sensor, you're going to be saving a lot of money on that, and you're going to be able to get plenty of a blurry background with a crop sensor camera. With that said, and this is the one that's really hard to like test for and look for, but I do notice that there is a full frame feel to my videos and photos that just generally feels a bit more premium and looks a bit more premium. but that's incredibly subjective, like a lot of other points in this video. And that doesn't mean the A6700 doesn't produce really good feeling videos and photos. Like this shot, for example, I think it looks great. And can you guess what camera it's shot with? That's right, the Sony ZV-E1, which is a full frame. I'm kidding. That shot is with the A6700, and I think it has a very good quote-unquote feel to it, and I'm overall just quite happy with how that looks. In terms of a winner, when it comes to camera body, there's just way too much there. The A6700 feels better in your hand if that matters to you, but the A7C Mark II is a full-frame camera, and that's a large part of what you're getting a camera for, is what the actual output is going to look like. So I think to choose a winner between those two, I think it's best for us more so to get into talking about who each camera is for, which is exactly what we're about to do once we talk about the cost differences between the two cameras. I have a lot of videos on the channel already about each of these cameras, as well as a lot more planned. So if you want to be a part of that and you don't want to miss out, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below. When it comes to price, there's absolutely a cost difference between the two. The A7C Mark II is coming in at $2,100 for the camera body only, and for $700 less, you can get the A6700 for $1,399. But you have to look a little bit deeper when it comes to the overall price. First off, from a lens perspective, there's a ton of really good Sony crop sensor lenses and a ton of really good Sony full frame lenses, and some third-party options that are pretty good as well, and you can save some money on third-party. But from a very rough estimate perspective, full-frame lenses are going to be about 30% more expensive than a crop sensor lens, so keep that in mind when you're thinking about the overall cost between the two. Which, simply put, A6700 is a lower cost, so we're going to say it wins this category. And right before we talk about which of these two cameras you should get, once you get one, you got to make sure that your videos look great. And I've put together a very in-depth guide for how I make this exact shot look great. So if you want to nail your studio shots for YouTube or for interviews, you might want to check that one out. I'll put a link for that down below, and you can use the code YouTube to save 25% on my making your videos look great guide and kind of checklist. It's going to help you out a lot. Okay, so the big question of which of these two cameras should you get, here's my thoughts. The general bucket for who these cameras are for is kind of simple. It's the content creator, it's the person who wants really high video quality as well as really good photo quality. In my opinion, they're also really good for somebody's first camera because they're pretty intuitive, they're quite user-friendly with a lot of pro-level specs to grow into. The pro can also jump in and utilize those high specs pretty quick. Who these cameras aren't for, look, if you need 2 SD card slots, you already know you're not getting these cameras as your main camera because you need 2 SD card slots for that insurance slot just in case one of them fails and you're charging good money for something that can't be reproduced. You're not getting these cameras, although they could make for a really good B cam in that situation. But back to who these cameras are for. If you want ridiculously high quality video and ridiculously high quality photo, that's what you're looking at these two cameras. I think if cost is on your mind, the A6700 is absolutely the way to go. I think at that $1,399 price point, I think this might be one of the most value-packed, feature-rich cameras that's on the market right now. Unless you want to use it for live streaming for longer than like 30 minutes. In that case, you're not going to be able to go with the A6700, and I'd encourage you to look into something like the FX30, which is very similar from a video perspective, and it's not going to overheat on you. Downside to the FX30 is it's not that well built for photos. So if you want a camera that does really good video and also really good photo with no overheating, A7C Mark II at a higher price point, but it's going to be the camera that's going to suit you best for all of those things. And if cost isn't a factor, obviously the A7C Mark II simply wins in almost every single category besides having the ability to shoot in 4K 120. And the photo quality coming out of the A7C Mark II is outstanding. The video quality is really good. The overheating concerns aren't there. It's a fantastic camera. But most importantly, if you want to see a ridiculously in-depth review of each of these cameras, you can check those videos out right there to dive deeper than what we did today. Oh, and you can check this out if you want to see some of my LUTs, presets, and guides that just might help you level up your photo and video work this year. I'll see you in the next video. Take care. See ya.